And I sighed, rubbing my eyes with the back of my hand. And down here, where the lights were red, not a single soul knew the day from the night. Sure, we had our clocks and watches to tell us the time, but our connections with the outside world was scarce. And these worthless red lights were infuriating. In fact, the clocks could say nearly 10 at night here, but we'd be waking up and getting ready for the next day. And the weight of millions of tons of water weighed on our little sub in a way more than physical, with a counselor being sent along to make sure everyone was evaluated frequently for mental stability. It was better than having somebody snap down here. Lacing up my boots, I headed to the command room. Last night, our third and final expedition had begun, and the results would most likely be returning any second. I didn't want to miss that. We'd been tasked with searching for new things, whether living or otherwise, down at the deepest parts of the seafloor. This was the furthest mission any living human had ever been on, so our mission got quite a lot of attention from the press. "Hey Eric, how's the mission going?" I waved at the man in front of the controller, who turned and gestured excitedly for me to come over. "You gotta see this." He pointed to the screen, a big LCD monitor that displayed the feed from the semi-autonomous mini-sub we use for unmanned missions even deeper than we could go, and then excitedly directed me to one of the locations on our feed. "I just saw it several seconds ago. What do you think it is?" Of course he asked me. I was a resident scientist on the trip, so if any classifications was needed, I was the man. But as I looked at the strange object on the screen, my mind drew a blank. What was that? Transmitted over our LCD screen, the object appeared grainy, but it didn't look like anything I'd seen or heard of before. With little white spikes, narrow as needle tips, jutting from the top of it. The thing looked almost bulbous in nature. It almost seemed like a jellyfish or one of those blobfish, but there were several things that made it look different. And though the body was pale, translucent white, a strange black goo seemed to be leaking from the orifices spread over the thing. There wasn't really a head on it, nor any tentacles, like an octopus, but along the middle of its body, the whole object was a thin black line. This was the weirdest part about it, since the line was moving. It swayed back and forth, moving almost separately from the body of whatever this was. "Bring it in, Eric." Eric turned to me excitedly. "Yeah, do we? Second time for the whole trip? This is actually something new?" I nodded, and he instantly began pressing buttons on the dashboard. The sub slowly moved toward the thing, opening the hatch to gently scoop it up. But as it did, however, the line reacted in a weird way. For just a second, I thought I saw the line itself split or open in some way as our sub closed in around it, almost as if it was some sort of mouth. But as I blinked, the line had returned to its original waving and swaying, as if nothing had happened. And I blinked again. Was the red light getting to me? Shaking my head, I rubbed my eyes. A few minutes later, I headed down to the retrieval dock with Eric. The sub was back, and it was time to see what the object was. This was the only part of my job I didn't like. I love looking at new things, but I never liked having to actually examine them. Eric pressed the button, pulling the holding tanks from the submarine. The object we had seen, eerily floating in the water of the tank, suspended amid the debris the sub had scooped up. I knocked against the glass. Would the line move like it did earlier? There was seemingly no reaction from the object. The line continued to wave back and forth, not reacting in the slightest to the noise. I pressed my hand against the glass. Something about the object unnerved me, but I couldn't think of what it was. As I stood there lost in thought, the object drifted toward my hand. "Look, do you see that?" Eric whispered behind me. I gestured to Eric to stop speaking with my other hand, keeping my hand on the glass. Inside the container, it slowly turned as it floated toward me, its head facing me, Were those needle-like spikes in its eyes? In a second, I heard the tiniest splitting sound and felt a searing pain in my hand. Oh! I recoiled from the glass, staring at my hand. One of the needle-like points had jutted through the container, seemingly splitting a minuscule point of glass, and jutting into my hand. Eric sprung into action. We couldn't let the container break further. Your hand all right? Yeah, it is, I said, rubbing the pinpoint spot where the needle had broken my skin. Just make sure you get that thing transferred into the bigger container and monitor it. If it can break even this glass, those needles are some serious sharp work. I watched as Eric worked, his back turned to me, transferring the thing into a new container. As he did, however, I noticed something. The black line was gone. The object still drifted around in the liquid. The spike still stood razor sharp on top of it, but the line that had been seen swaying earlier was gone. Eric, do you see that? See what? He turned to face me, and I recoiled. Staring at the very utmost part of his forehead, a gigantic split had opened up. Like some sort of tear, a large and gaping mouth traveled down his body, vertically, from the top of his head to near his pelvis. This gaping maw split his body. Inside it, I saw blackness and black goo dripping from within it, falling onto the floor. The white teeth looked like legions, each one around 2 inches long and razor sharp, thin like the spikes of the bulbous object. Eric didn't even seem to notice that his mouth and nose were gone, that his stomach was gone, or that his chest was split open, all replaced with the horrific mouth that gaped at me. On the other side of the split, his eyes stared at me, no emotion showing except for confusion. How did it get him? Was it some sort of parasite? Fumbling backwards, I felt my hand close on a long wrench set on a nearby table. Before I could think, I was on him, swinging it down viciously at his face. I felt it connect and watched him crumble to the ground. Turning, I rushed toward the exit, the wrench still clutched in my hand. I had to get help, to find crew members to alert. As I opened the door from the bay, the most I could do was scream. A crew member stood there, staring at me, but her eyes weren't what I noticed. Instead, I saw the mouth, vertically tearing her body in two, the razor-sharp teeth planted within, and the eerie black goo dripping from the darkest depths of that creature's mouth. How could it have infected her as well? I hit harder this time, with 2 hands clamped firmly around the wrench. I couldn't let this thing get back to the surface. I'd read enough stories about things like this happening, whether they emerged from the depths of the sea or from the far reaches of space. No matter where it came from, the stories were always the same. A parasite infected one person, and before we knew it, the human race was overwhelmed, with contaminated humans running rampant and terror reigning. It's definitely a shocking story, and one that I wasn't about to let play out. I acted swiftly, running through our little submarine. I didn't know how, but it had infected all of them. There wasn't a single soul left on board the ship, not a single person who didn't have that same gaping maw splitting their body wide open. Several hours later, however, I began to wonder something. Staring at myself in the mirror, I wasn't sure what it meant. Did the wide mouth grinning sideways back at me, razor-sharp teeth, and black goo mean that I was the only one that had been infected? Or had it infected anyone at all? Was all this just because of the red lights? No, well, there was nothing I could change now. Either way, I had to do it. I raised the wrench, now dripping crimson red, far above my head, and swung downwards.